ladies and gentlemen, Ted Heath and I were friends. I met him before he became Prime Minister. I worked with him when he was Prime Minister, and we stayed in contact through the rest of our lives. When I was invited to give this speech, it became evident that the house in which Ted Heath lived was close to where I was stationed when I was here with the 84th Infantry Division of the United States, where I was near Winchester. All this occurred before I was Henry Kissinger. So it is not a known fact. But I visited Salisbury several times while I was in Winchester. And so I have a great feeling for where Ted Heath lived. I thought what I could do here is to describe our interaction with Ted Heath when he was Prime Minister, what the issues were, where sometimes we agreed and occasionally we didn't agree, but we always respected him as one of the important figures of our time and with a vision for Europe that is historic. So when the Tories unexpectedly won the 1970 election, Richard Nixon was so elated that he called me on the telephone nearly every hour to update me on the status of the returns. In terms of our hierarchy, it should of course have been the other way around. Part of Nixon's enthusiasms for Heath was the comparability of their rides to office. Heath was the first Tory Prime Minister to be selected by a vote of the Conservative members of Parliament rather than by a consensus of party eminences. Both Heath and Nixon were admitted into the establishment, not defined by it. And this awareness shaped in important ways their combination of remoteness and high analytical skill. In Heath's case, these qualities were combined with an extraordinary knowledge and love of music, which evoked in him unexpected episodes of personal warmth. I intend this comparison with Nixon as a tribute. Of the 10 presidents who honored me by allowing me to participate in the conduct of foreign policy, some tangentially, others more intensively, Nixon was the best prepared, and in his impact on the international system, perhaps the most transformational. To the Nixon administration, as to its predecessors, The wartime alliance was still personal. We respected the vision by which Winston Churchill had transformed Britain's imperial preeminence into partnership with America, held together by intangible ties of shared history and buttressed through informal arrangement between leaders. In its operation, British diplomats occasionally augmented the traditional diplomatic practice of balancing interests with an element of paternal guidance, if necessary, evoking a sense of guilt if we deviated from our being the less sophisticated partner. This intimacy between two governments had enabled a succession of British leaders of both parties to transform the wartime alliance into an Atlantic partnership. Ted Heath continued this tradition in the management of geostrategic issues. Relations with the Soviet Union were closely coordinated. In the Middle East, both leaders inherited an undeclared Israeli-Egyptian air battle along the Suez Canal. A Syrian invasion of Jordan followed in 1970, while terrorism made its first systematic appearance. Finally, the outbreak of the 1973 Middle East War imposed a new emphasis on diplomacy. In all of these crises, two of which included partial alerts of US forces, close cooperation with Britain, and between the President and the Prime Minister was a key element of American policy. It was when Heath undertook the delicate passage of Britain into Europe that issues arose in the operation of this special relationship, which were inherent in the nature of the problem and not in the policies of the individual leaders. The objective of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was the common security of individual states based on a shared definition of both threats and strategies to deal with them. The emerging European structure, however, strove to express a specifically European identity by way of institutions which would, over time, merge into a supranational entity. The simultaneous quest for both European and Atlantic integration were therefore not always easy to reconcile. International developments compounded structural issues. The Nixon administration inherited a war in Vietnam from which it sought to extricate itself at a pace that did not undermine the American position as the guarantor of alliances. Some of our European allies urged more rapid withdrawals to provide relief from their own domestic pressures. The Nixon administration sought to overcome the domestic obsession with the Vietnam War by putting forward a new concept of world order. It opened to China and engaged in negotiations with the Soviet Union, especially on arms control. These openings, especially to China, needed to be conducted with a minimum of external consultation to avoid a paralyzing domestic debate. For Heath, who was pursuing his own opening to China, the secrecy and suddenness of our policy implied a sense of unnecessary preemption. In the end, he achieved the same goals by a decisive move along the same paths, and China policy will stand as a monument to Heath's incumbency in office. These differences might have strained some relationships, were it not for the mutual respect and admiration felt by those responsible for its conduct, including on the ministerial level, where Alec Hume and Peter Carrington provided extraordinary inspiration. Having said all of this, the role of the statesman is to take his society from where it is to where it has never been. Ted Heath will count among the important statesmen of his period, because the Britain he inherited, first as a key figure in the pro-European wing of the Conservative Party, and later as Prime Minister, had been ambivalent about its options between developing closer relations with the United States, reimagining the Commonwealth, or entering Europe unreservedly. It had rejected the Schuman Plan and the European Defence Community. Even Churchill argued that if the unified Europe he advocated forced Britain to choose between Europe or the open sea, it would choose the latter. Heath rejected the inevitability of such a choice. He was ever mindful of the fate of Harold Macmillan, whose bid for entry into the common market Charles de Gaulle had branded an Anglo-Saxon Trojan horse. He managed Britain's entry into Europe in a way that combined a dramatic adaptation of traditional British policies with determination to preserve Britain's core national interests. His successor, Harold Wilson, anchored the outcome among the public by a referendum that indicated its approval in 1975. Heath welcomed this event with the following statement: "I have worked for this for 25 years. I was the Prime Minister who led Britain into the community. So I'm naturally delighted that the referendum is working out as it is." Over the succeeding decades, a political European Union was built, and the essence of both the Atlantic relationship and the special relationships were preserved. But now, 4 decades later, the global context has changed profoundly, raising the issues of Ted Heath's time in a new and even more complex form. Then the challenge was how to maintain Atlantic unity under the conditions of approaching nuclear parity. The threat was from the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. Today, the threat is far-reaching, ambiguous, amorphous, and posing new forms of danger. New capabilities of technology have emerged in multiple aspects, like cyber and artificial intelligence, for which an agreed strategy does not yet exist. They are accompanied by forms of international conduct unimagined a generation ago. Global upheavals rent the continents from multitudinous causes, and the remedies are not always in alignment. The most significant global questions then become: what concept of world order can restore stability, or even establish criteria by which to fashion a common design? Should the Atlantic Alliance conceive its reach as global? What is the relationship of the European Union to the creation of world order? Or will the world evolve into regional spheres of influence which combine their relations unconstrained by the Westphalian system? And if so, how will it be possible to avoid an even more cataclysmic outcome than the 2 world wars of European origin? In these circumstances, Brexit, which was at first seen as a primarily British domestic issue, has taken on a more general significance. On one level, it will lead to new negotiations on a British relationship with Europe. That relationship needs to be close and organic. Such an outcome is in the overwhelming interest of both countries, of both parties, and of world order. And America's interest is to encourage that process of linking Europe and Britain, and to help the process if temporary dislocations occur. In a deeper sense, the resolution of Brexit will resurrect the issues of 1973. In the new structure, there will be 3 elements: the European Union, Britain with a special negotiated relationship with Europe, and the US as the custodian of common security. How can Europe forge a sense of unity and maintain the sense of diversity from which its genius derived? How can the articulation of a European identity be combined with Atlantic partnership? Can a monetary union be maintained without a common fiscal policy? And how can a common strategy emerge from such a structure? What is important to understand about the present world is that for 300 years, the world has been organized on principles first developed by Europe. The idea of the nation state, the notion of sovereignty, the concept of a rules-based system. In the operation of the system, Europe, Britain, and the United States have played a decisive role. And whatever emerges out of the present negotiations should keep in mind that in order to restore world order and to act on the principles that led to its greatness, Europe and America must not drift apart. They need to resist the silent calls of their respective neutralisms. The new centers of power all around the world should not be tempted to exploit the disputes of the Atlantic community or the disputes in Europe. In the structure emerging from Brexit, Britain could perform its historic and global role, contributing to a world order that is stable and forward-looking through an Atlantic partnership. The question of how to forge European unity while honoring diversity that inspires loyalty and creativity is not a bureaucratic, but essentially a moral and political task. Permit me a few personal words. I first met Ted Heath before he became Prime Minister, and I stayed in friendly contact with him until his death. He participated in a discussion group that I chaired under the auspices of the Aspen Institute, which met in the United States and Iran in 1978 and in Germany in 1980. My last encounter with Ted Heath was at Catherine Graham's funeral in 2001, which he attended on his own as a token of friendship because of their common service on the Brunt Commission. When he retired from Parliament in 2004, I wrote to him to tell him how much I admired his service to the cause of freedom and to the relationship of Britain with Europe. He replied, telling me that on the big issues, he and I had always seen things in the same way. I was proud of this note. I admired Ted's integrity, his courage, his devotion to service, and strange as it may seem to those who knew Ted only as a leader, his capacity for personal warmth. He performed great services for Europe and the cause of freedom as an essential bridge between its country's past and its future. His is a legacy worthy of recognition. As Britain, Europe, and America, hopefully together, face the challenges that lie ahead.
There are many people here in this room tonight who knew Ted Heath extremely well. He was, I think, by any yardstick, a statesman. But I think, as we all know, Ted could occasionally be a little prickly. I remember Douglas Hurd telling me on one occasion Ted was dining at Downing Street with a lady on either side of him whom he totally ignored. And Douglas, being a good private secretary at the time, wrote Ted a note which said, "Prime Minister, please speak to the women on either side of you." To which Ted replied in a little note that he sent back, "I have." And that was the end of their conversation that evening. But what Ted did do was engage on the very big issues, and you have touched on a number of them this evening. Let me turn to something that was implicit in, I think, what you were saying. When you were Secretary of State and Ted was in number 10, we spoke of the international order, and we knew exactly what the international order was. I'm not at all sure to many of us that we are quite as clear these days exactly what the international order is or what it stands for. And I recall a quarter of a century ago now, George Bush Sr. referring to a new world order emerging. Again, I'm not sure entirely what that world order may be, and I'd welcome your thoughts, given what you had to say about the Atlantic relationship and the importance of utilizing the prestige both of the United States and of Europe.
Well, the world order, which I studied at university and in which I grew up, was based on the nation state. And it developed in Europe at the end of the 30 Years' War, in which the doctrine of sovereignty emerged as a companion, and ideas of international law that laid down certain rules of conduct. At that time, at the end of a war that had been fought in part about the religious beliefs within societies, it was tacitly agreed, and in fact explicitly agreed, that intervention in the domestic affairs of other states was not a subject of international policy, but international aggression consisted of the crossing of borders or the violation of borders of established states. There were, of course, periods in which this was violated, such as during the French Revolution. But the basic structure of the international order, when I was in office and when he came into office, was essentially based on the nation state. And the principal elements of security were still the states of Europe plus Russia, which had been at the fringe of that international order through all of its existence. China was only beginning to emerge in the 70s. Countries like India were just beginning their international role. The Middle East, for all of its crises, was on the whole a conflict between various states, some of them radical, some of them less so. The current situation is radically different. When the West speaks of a rules-based system, there are major countries that feel that they did not participate in the creation of that system, and they're not therefore obliged to observe it. In addition, states are now emerging that are based on principles of legitimacy that are not based on the Westphalian concept, but that are based on the nature of their domestic structure. So that in the Middle East, at the time that Heath was in office, one heard relatively little about the conflict between Sunni and Shia. That was just a contributing element. But now the nature of the structure of domestic systems in itself becomes an issue of international insecurity. And now we also are dealing with a technology of extraordinary scope, going far beyond what we experienced. In our period, we were deeply concerned about the catastrophic impact of nuclear weapons. But the use of them was essentially confined to two countries. And the assumption was, it turned out to be more or less correct, that the damage they would do to each other was so huge that they would not resort to nuclear weapons. But now, nuclear technology has proliferated to many countries, and new forms of technology have emerged, like cyber or artificial intelligence, which create totally new vistas. And in that world now, so formerly peripheral countries can produce enormous dislocations, and formerly dominant countries have not necessarily defined what their role is in these new circumstances. We have upheavals in many continents simultaneously, but the upheavals are not caused by the same issues. And therefore, to develop a coherent view is a totally new challenge. And this is why I pay such attention to what can be done within the Atlantic region, at least to get a coherent view. But this is a sketch of the difference between the period in which Ted Heath was in office and I was in office, and the challenge we face today.
Let me pick up a part of that then, and the bit of most relevance, I think, to everyone present this evening, the Atlantic Alliance. What do you think the Atlantic Alliance actually means in practice today? Do you think it needs refreshing? Do you think it's working well? Are you concerned of the way in which Europe, on a number of occasions, seems to have sharply different views from the United States? You once memorably asked a very famous question: what is Europe's telephone number? Do you know what it is today?
Well, I know what it is today, but I may not like what it says. A fundamental challenge for the Atlantic Alliance is to define what it is trying to do. What is it we're trying to prevent? And what is it we're trying to achieve? And what is it that we will achieve only as allies? And what may we feel we are obliged to do even without allies? And our allies should understand these answers. That is a dialogue that has yet to take place.
How do you think, in present circumstances, we can bring the collective will of the United States and Europe closer together than it at present appears to be?
Well, of course, some depends on how the Brexit period is resolved. I cannot imagine an Atlantic strategy in which Britain and Europe and the United States are not attempting to find common answers. And so from this point of view, while I took no position during the Brexit debate, thinking that it was a matter for Britain to decide, I think that to the extent that Britain plays an active role in trying to evoke an answer to this question, it will play an extremely important role. And in order to get an answer, it cannot be that the United States prescribes all the answers and Europe passively then criticizes. I mean, in a well-understood alliance, we would know, or we would come to some conclusion of how to resolve issues like Syria and not continue to do things that make the situation more acute rather than resolve it.
If you look at right across the Middle East, you see the most extraordinary, complex interrelationship of problems. But where would you begin, were you Secretary of State today, where would you begin to unravel the chaos that is Syria in an event to bring an end to what we now see happening, the destruction of a nation and the death of huge numbers of people who just happen to be caught in the wrong place at the wrong time in the midst of the wrong dispute?
Well, let me say, first of all, in the present structure of the Middle East, emerged in this Sykes-Picot agreement in 1919. And it was based on the concept that there would be a British sphere, which was more or less Iraq, and a French sphere, which was Syria. These spheres would be constituted as states, but they were not states in the European sense. They were a collection of ethnic groups, religious groups, and so these morsels were put together in a way that facilitated their management from the outside. So Iraq, which has a Shia majority, was governed by a Sunni minority. Syria, which has a Sunni majority, was governed by a Shia minority. And that worked tolerably well as long as Britain and France were the major custodians of the region, and the governments could orient themselves to a dominant country. With the decline of British and French power, and in the absence of any other outside power, these states became extremely fragile, and to apply to them the principles of the Westphalian system made the situation more complicated. So in Iraq, we removed the Sunni ruler, and we thought that this would lead to democracy. But it couldn't lead to democracy. It led to a civil war. In Syria, we proposed that the Shia leader be removed, again believing that this reflected the will of the people. But the people of these countries were above all determined not to be governed by any of the other principles that existed there. So that too started a civil war. And Libya did the same. In Libya, the same thing happened. So then the issue is, can we salvage that situation by finding a coalition government? And I think it is essential after our election quiets down that we go beyond the tactical management of the situation into hopefully some consensus with our allies as to a solution that is more likely to bring stability and peace, and that takes into account some of the elements that I mentioned here, because I think a pure tactical management of this crisis will guarantee that it gets worse and worse.
Right, now we're going to come to questions. David, are you going to invigilate?
Who would like to ask Dr. Kissinger the first question from the floor?
Dr. Kissinger, you played a remarkable role in stabilizing the world. You left it in a much safer place, not least because you made this great contribution by developing détente, translating common interests into rules, and then developing détente on many fronts. Having left the world a safer place then, in the mid-70s, and comparing it with the world now, would you say that it is a safer place now still, or a less safe place?
The world in which I was influential in policy was more dangerous in the sense that if something went wrong, it would be really catastrophic. The world now is more complex, and therefore in the long term more dangerous, because there are means at the disposal of more people that do not have the same sense of limits that existed then, and it could lead to complications. For example, if you look at the nuclear problems in our day, you could assume that the damage to both sides in a nuclear war would be so huge that it would operate as a great restraint. But now that so many third countries have nuclear weapons, and if they get involved with a major country, they can affect the balance between major countries. And major countries can be tempted to intervene, much as like World War I started, to prevent things that haven't happened and may not even be on anybody's mind. And then modern technology creates opportunities for harassment and pressure that you get used to managing until someday you don't manage it. If you look at the history of World War I, the crisis that led to World War I was no worse than 10 others that had been solved in the previous decade, so that the mere fact that another crisis occurred in the summer of 1914 would not automatically evoke a picture of a global crisis. And I would add, at least in the world that I know best, in the internet world, that generations that are trained to react instantaneously to impressions and not to long-range thinking may be less good custodians of extreme possibilities. So I think we live in a more dangerous world, even though the immediate consequences. And this is why we need more long-range thinking.
Is there one final question? Yes, at the back.
My name's Quentin Peel. I'm formerly of the Financial Times, now at Chatham House. 3 years ago, I had a long conversation with Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the former German foreign minister, in Berlin, on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of Britain joining the European community. And the one question I asked him was, why was Germany always so much more enthusiastic about British membership of the European community than France? And he didn't hesitate at all. He said it was because we were convinced that if Britain was in the European community, America would trust us. But if Britain was not, they would think it was all a terrible plot. Do you think that when Britain leaves the European Union, America will trust it less?
The basis of the British relationship with America was created before there was a European community. And I did not like the argument during the Brexit debate that Britain would go to the end of the line if it were not backed by Europe, because we have a historic relationship. And also because I hope that Britain, in the discussions that are now going on, will play a role in emphasizing the importance of the Atlantic relationship. So in my thinking, I would hope that out of all of these discussions emerges a Britain that has linkages, close linkages to Europe, but also represents the conscience of an Atlantic relationship. And so I would not think it's necessary to make that choice. But I do think that Britain's greatness was developed in a period before there was a European community. So I think Britain can continue to play a major role within the parameters that I have tried to explain.
Dr. Kissinger, Sir John, on behalf of everyone, I would like to say how much we've enjoyed tonight, which has truly been a memorable occasion, thanks to your participation. Thank you.